Right, so this lecture is on memory and different ways that you can remember information that you will learn either in class or in your textbook, etc. So this is the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. So we'll start with that. So essentially, Ebbinghaus was a researcher or scientist that actually looked into memory and how we forget. So this base chart basically will give you what happens with information when you first receive it. So 100% of the information you'll remember. And so over time, you'll tend to forget the information. If you can see that even within a few hours, you'll forget 60% of that information that you've learned. So if you don't look at the information, then after a week, it's only 20%. And as you go on, eventually you'll be at 0% of the information that you would receive or remember, basically. So essentially, in order to remember that information that you learn or receive, so what you want to do is basically, once you receive the information, you want to review the information. So basically, you'll in short periods look at the information. So immediately after you'll look at the information, still remember that information, and basically work on getting the information locked into your long-term memory. So you'll look at the information, review, then review again. And then as time passes, then the longer that time you will need in order to review the information. So for some of you guys, basically, or a lot of you, to remember the information during finals or during exams, what you want to do is basically review the information often in the very beginning, and then later on you would not spend or have a space of time in between when you would review the information. And then immediately before the exam, you would definitely re-review what you've learned. So all of this would mean that you would lock that information in long-term memory. It also would prevent you from stressing out about studying for exams because you've already done the studying at the very beginning instead of towards the end, closer to the exam. So in the next slide, basically, we're going to look at what's called the information processing system. So essentially memory. Okay, so just remember, it's the information processing system. And so you receive a lot of information through senses. So if you think about all your senses, you have basically the sight, what you hear, smell, taste. So those are all the senses. So you would receive that information, and then what you'll have to, what happens is that the information is put into what's called the sensory memory. And so information there would last about 3 minutes or so unless you pay attention to it. So once you decide to pay attention to it, then it goes into what's called your short-term memory. And within short-term memory, it's divided into your immediate memory, which will take about 5 to 20 seconds until you forget the information, unless you start working on the information. So working memory would mean that you're looking at the information and repeating that information or rehearsing that information. So that is working memory. So in order to actually move it into the next level of memory, you have to actually have active strategies. And we'll be talking about that in a few moments regarding what kind of active strategies. So active strategies actually move the information you've learned into what's called long-term memory. So active strategies actually encode the information that you've learned so that it's kind of like a computer where things need to be coded into the computer database in order for the computer to remember it. So once you encode it, then it's easier for you to retrieve the information or essentially recall the information. So that is the information processing system. In other words, it's how you would remember things, or what is called your memory. So let's kind of talk about what affects memory. So there are different things, lifetime factors that affect memory. So some of the things, well, first of all, memory essentially is the chemical and electrical function of the brain. So essentially, it's when neurotransmitters are released. And in order for the brain to function well, it needs to have oxygen, nutrients, and rest. And so here are some of the things that would affect all of that, how your brain functions, etc. So information overload. So being careful about being overloaded with the information, finding ways so that you can break down that information will help. The next thing is stress, because stress oftentimes would result in different things, including not having enough rest. When you're stressed, you breathe more shallow. You don't get a lot of oxygen, so that might be another thing. For some people, stress also causes you not to eat as much. The other thing is cigarettes. So cigarettes, as well as drugs, basically affect how you take in oxygen. It may prevent oxygen from getting to your brain. It also affects nutrients. It definitely affects rest. So those are things that you probably want to either reduce or avoid. Alcohol is the same thing. So other things would be some of the health challenges students might have. High blood pressure, which means definitely it's about rest, about getting the right kind of foods to prevent high blood pressure. Lack of nutrients, so not eating, lack of sleep, again, would affect how you would remember things. Lack of oxygen would be the last thing. When you practice some of the things that we just mentioned, definitely will affect your memory. So those are some things that affect memory. So let's talk about different strategies in order for you to remember information. So here's our ways to treat the information so that you would remember what you've learned. So essentially there is several things. So first is understand it. So making some sense of the information and connecting with something you already know would be one of the top strategies. Organize it, which means looking at the information and putting things into different categories and also relating it to the information that you've received to other information that you have. The next thing is space it, which essentially is about spacing the time that you would review the material. So there is a video in the resource area of your Canvas that talks about how to practice the space it strategy. Another thing is chunking it, which means if you have a large amount of information that you have to remember, breaking it down into smaller things rather than looking at the entire thing. So breaking it into smaller, more manageable pieces would help you remember the information. So test it essentially is about creating some pre-tests before you take the exam, or even going into your textbook and taking the post-test or the pre-test. So that's testing yourself. Also using flashcards would be one way as far as testing it. You already did the Cornell notes, which has a built-in way of testing yourself, right? The other thing which I definitely encourage a lot of students to do is enjoy the information, basically. So that could result in you creating pictures, using colors, could be through highlighting or using different inks to write up the information, creating stories. The biggest thing that's, I think, helpful for a lot of students is creating acronyms or acrostics, and we already talked about that. So acronyms would be something like SNC or SMART, which is for SMART goal. Acrostic would be a phrase that you would use, like if you had to remember the notes of in music, every good boy does fine. So that would be represent the notes of the music, basically. Um, the next thing would be manipulate the information. So it's essentially meaning being active when you're studying. So using your hands, saying stuff out loud, moving around when you're studying. So those are different ways to sort of look at the information and play with the information. So you'll see on the edges, so right up here is about repetition. So again, repetition is about you looking at the information in different ways, not just reading the information over and over again. And repetition, if you think about one way, would be the Cornell notes, where you're taking information. So that's on one part of the notebook paper, and then you basically look at the information again when you do the recall column, where you're actually creating questions or prompts. And then the other repeat would be you basically doing a summary of what you've learned. So that's repetition. But repetition should not be you reading the information, the textbook, or your notes over and over again. So that it should be in different ways that you would look at the information. I already mentioned the breakdown tasks. So breaking down the information that you need to look at, so into smaller pieces. Down here is mnemonics. So mnemonics would be the acrostics and the acronyms. Again, acrostic would be a catchphrase that you would create. Acrostic would be the first letter of every word that in a sentence that you have to remember, or concepts, basically. Now, right here would be overlearn. Overlearn is a more advanced technique. This is when you actually look at after you've actually learned the information, know the information well. Overlearning means that you'll go over the information, but what you're going to do is change how you, or in what area you actually look at the information. So if you normally study in the library, it means that you would go to maybe a coffee shop and study the information. Maybe on the bus you'll study the information. Maybe outside on the lawn you'd study the information. And so when you do this, basically you inoculate yourself from anything that might happen in the exam room. So if you go to the exam room, no matter what happens, you'd be able to remember the information. Because I think oftentimes students will go to an exam and then they may hear somebody tapping on the floor, or something in the class might happen, and then you forget the information, and that stresses you out. But doing this overlearning technique would definitely be helpful, but it only helps if you already know the information. So essentially we went over what is memory and what are things that you need to do in order to make sure that you're able to remember things. And then the last thing we went into was different ways to play around with the information so you remember the information. So essentially, have fun with the information and how you're trying to remember it. It doesn't have to be sort of straightforward. You need to just look at the information the way that you wrote it down or how the professor wrote it down. It's about you determining the best way for you to learn. So just remember your learning style and what works best for you.